An operating theatre on wheels. It brings a much-needed service right to people's doorsteps. This may seem like an ordinary truck, but inside it is a sophisticated clinic. Out of it come tents and a laboratory. It takes under an hour to get it all set up. The patients are here for a simple procedure, circumcision. According to the World Health Organization, getting circumcised can reduce the chances of a heterosexual man contracting HIV by approximately 60%.
Okay, I'm going to stop the video there because this is the particular myth I want to deal with, which is the myth of a 60% reduced risk of transference of HIV amongst circumcised men. Now, I don't blame the BBC particularly here, they're just reporting what the World Health Organization is saying. But the studies that this 60% figure is based on had serious problems. It's a list that goes on and which will likely make your jaw drop as you read it. They were so bad they could be used as a case study in bad science. Now, Brian D. Earp has written an excellent summary of a detailed paper by Boyle and Hill, which explains their concerns with the studies, and both are well worth reading. In this video, I'm just going to draw from their conclusions and give you my own top 6 out of this laundry list of problems with the studies. Number 6. No placebo control. No placebo control was possible since it's obviously not possible to administer a placebo circumcision. Anyone who is circumcised or not is fully aware of their status. Oh, and in this study, not only were circumcised men aware of their status, but doctors also provided them additional counselling about safe sex practices that the uncircumcised men were not provided with. I know. My jaw hit the floor at this point too. Boyle and Hill. Participants in the immediate male circumcision groups also received 2 years of free medical treatment plus supportive counselling and safe sex advice, difficult to provide in any large-scale rollout of male circumcision in Sub-Saharan Africa. WHO had specifically cautioned that the female-to-male Kenyan and Ugandan findings might not generalise to real-world settings. Number 5. The studies were stopped early, after good results, something which has been proven to create an overestimation on the effectiveness of treatments in trials. You can't just stop a scientific study because you happen to like the results you've got so far. This is like somebody sitting an exam, getting the first 2 out of 10 questions correct, and then boldly proclaiming they don't need to carry on since they have a 100% success rate so far. No, that's not how it works. Perhaps the first 2 questions on the test were particularly easy, just as perhaps in the circumcision studies there were early events occurring that might reduce transmission of HIV. Like, number 4. Newly circumcised participants had to refrain from sex until their wounds healed. That's right. For much of the actual duration of the study, circumcised participants were not sexually active while their wounds healed. I have to ask the question, how does anybody who is running a study like this have any confidence whatsoever in the conclusions they're giving? Surely it's incredibly obvious that if somebody has wounded, bandaged and painful genitals and advice from doctors to refrain from sex, it's going to reduce the transmission rate of HIV. This fact seems to have been simply swept under the rug as inconvenient. Brian D. Earp again. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. As Boyle and Hill point out, the men who were circumcised got additional counselling about safe sex practices compared to the control group, and then they had to refrain from having sex altogether for the simple reason that their lacerated penises had to be wrapped in bandages until their wounds healed, leading to what Boyle and Hill refer to as time-out discrepancy in the quote above. By contrast, the non-circumcised men got to keep having sex during the full 2-month period during which the treatment group was in recovery mode. Then, due to a statistically significant effect having been detected, the trials were stopped early, which tends to lead to an overestimation of the true effect. Size of the treatment. These issues may pose problems for the scientific credibility of the studies. Taken together with the other flaws, here's why. Let us assume for a second that the circumcised men really did end up getting infected with HIV at a lower rate than the control group men who were left intact, even though, as we'll see in a moment, it would be premature to be convinced that this is so. Why might that outcome have happened? If you answered because those men knew they were in the treatment group in the first place, had less sex over the duration of the study because they had bandaged, wounded penises for much of it, and had safer sex when they had it, because they receive free condoms and special counselling from the doctors, thereby reducing their overall exposure to HIV compared to the control group, then you're on the right track. Number 3. Parallel studies into effects circumcision has on male-to-female transmission of HIV were also stopped early, after they demonstrated an apparent 61% increase in transmission of HIV following circumcision. As Boyle and Hill put it, in contrast, a parallel RCT into male-to-female sexual transmission of HIV in Uganda demonstrated that male circumcision increases male-to-female transmission of HIV. In the male-to-female trial, women were unwittingly exposed to HIV infection since male sexual partners subjected to male circumcision were already HIV positive. Several women subsequently became HIV positive following their participation in the trial, raising concerns about informed consent. While male circumcision has not been recommended for HIV positive men, in real-life settings, HIV testing cannot be assured and does not always occur prior to the circumcision intervention. The present critique raises several methodological, ethical and legal concerns with these trials, suggesting that the decision by WHO UNAIDS to recommend male circumcision as a prophylactic HIV prevention measure in Sub-Saharan Africa was unwarranted. Number 2. Put bluntly, the researchers were very likely to be biased. Again from Boyle and Hill. Researcher expectation bias. The principal investigators had a history of co-authoring papers promoting male circumcision, e.g. Gray and Warwer had co-authored more than 100 joint papers, indicating their close collaboration. The names of no fewer than 14 co-authors appeared on the reports of both Ugandan trials, suggesting the two trials were not independent. Analysis of the references cited in common across the 4 trials also reveals substantial overlap. Claims by Overt et al. As to the protective effect of MC, male circumcision, when the trials were terminated prematurely, and that, if women are aware of the protective effect of MC, this awareness could encourage males to become circumcised, suggest a lack of equipoise. Siegfried et al. Warned that researchers' personal biases and the dominant circumcision practices of their respective countries may influence their interpretation of findings. The RCT lead investigators were all documented circumcision advocates who collaborated closely and concurred in recommending the mass circumcision of millions of African men. And number 1. The reported figure of 60% is a relative reduction and actually equates to a 1.31% absolute reduction in transmission of HIV, a figure small enough to not be statistically significant. Brian D. Earp again. Experimental design issues notwithstanding, it's tempting to think that the 60% figure that's being thrown around in the media reports is just too large a percentage to ignore, even if the studies had some flaws. But do you know what the 60% statistic is actually referring to? Boyle and Hill explain. What does the frequently cited 60% relative reduction in HIV infections actually mean? Across all 3 female-to-male trials, of the 5,411 men subjected to male circumcision, 64, 1.18%, became HIV positive. Among the 5,497 controls, 137, 2.49%, became HIV positive. So the absolute decrease in HIV infection was only 1.31%. That's right, 60% is the relative reduction in infection rates, comparing 2 very small percentages. A bit of arithmetic that generates a big seeming number, yet one which, without also reporting the absolute risk reduction alongside, arguably misrepresents the results of the study. The absolute decrease in HIV infection between the treatment and control groups in these experiments was just 1.31%, which is likely to have no appreciable effect at the demographic level. Another way of looking at it, the chance of winning the UK lottery is about 1 in 14 million. I can increase my relative chances of winning it by 100% if I just buy an extra ticket. See how great relative increases sound? I'm still incredibly unlikely to win the lottery though, with my pair of tickets, with odds of 1 in 7 million. Now, I'm not a scientist by any means, but just looking at this mess of jumbled information and bad science briefly is enough to tell me that these studies were designed and carried out to support a particular agenda. When, despite this, the flawed studies showed only a 1.31% absolute reduction in transmission, the researchers presented the deceptively high 60% relative reduction instead, and even that figure was found to be overstated once all of the data was collated and relevant adjustments made. In short, the World Health Organization is acting to circumcise men in Africa based on bad science, and deliberately misrepresented results from a group of documented circumcision advocates. These studies did not show a statistically significant reduction in HIV transmission among circumcised men.
The men and boys who want to get circumcised start off here, where they're given information about circumcision and its benefits. Then into the second tent over there, where they're tested for HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases. Then after getting a physical examination and they're all clear, they then head up the steps and into the operating theater. The patients here can be as young as 10 as long as they get parental consent before the operation.